I'm Lisa DeSisto, publisher of the Portland Press Herald. I hope we found you safe and healthy tonight, and thank you for joining us for Maine Voices Live. Thank you again to our sponsors H.M. Payson, Stroudwater Lodge, Hub Furniture, and Portland Downtown. Their generous support, along with the support from our subscribers, makes our journalism possible. Now to tonight's host and guest. Kelley Bouchard is our host tonight. She's a staff writer with the Portland Press Herald, and she focuses on what's happening in South Portland, Cape Elizabeth, and Scarborough. She is a Maine native and a University of Maine graduate. She was a college intern for 2 summers at the former Lewiston Evening Journal. And before joining us at the Press Herald, she was a reporter for the Ipswich Chronicle, Beverly Times, and the Salem Evening News in Massachusetts. Another Lewiston Auburn native is our guest tonight, Cynthia McFadden, who joined NBC News in 2014 and has covered a range of stories across the U.S. and around the globe, scored many exclusive interviews, and gets rare access. Cynthia recently debuted a new female-focused series on the nightly news called Her Take with Cynthia McFadden, where she's interviewed Cindy McCain, Queen Latifah, Rosemarie Aquilina, the judge in the Larry Nassar case, all women with vastly different experiences. Her work has won many of broadcasting's most coveted prizes, including most recently the Emmy she won for Hard News Feature for her story on the child miners of Madagascar. Please welcome to our virtual stage 2 distinguished journalists from Lewiston, Kelley Bouchard and Cynthia McFadden.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hey, Kelley. Here we
Welcome.
are.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you. And welcome, everybody. Cynthia, thanks again for being here with us today, tonight. You were born at Central Maine General in Lewiston, but you grew up in Auburn, one of Auburn's best and brightest. Curious about what it was like for you growing up in Lewiston, Auburn, and what your family life was like. And you went to Edward Little. I have to tell you, I was a Lewiston Blue Devil, but my parents were each Red Eddies, so you can maybe forgive me a little bit. But what was it like growing up in Lewiston, Auburn?
Well, first of all, I grew up watching Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News every night. And when he talked about LA, I thought he meant Lewiston, Auburn. So I had a lot to learn.
Yeah.
Lewiston, Auburn was really, it was a great place to grow up. My parents were wonderful, loving, supportive. I was an only child, and neither of them had the privilege of going to college. And they both believed in education. So they did everything they could possibly do to make sure that I was able to go to college, and that they would make sure that they could pay for it. And that was no small task. My father worked for 50 years for what was then New England Tell and Tell. And my mother stayed at home. And, I don't think my dad ever made much more than $35,000 a year. So I was lucky enough to win a full scholarship to Bates. I won the state debate championship as a junior, and it came with a scholarship. And I said, but I don't want to go to Bates. I want to go to Bowdoin. Now, my father said, little girl, you've worked really hard. You should, if Bowdoin will take you, then that's what you should do.
Wow.
So I got in, and the letter came in the mail, and I said, Daddy, they say we can apply for financial aid. And he said, nope, that's for the people who need it. Your mother and I have saved the money, and we want to send you to Bowdoin.
Wow.
So what a privilege. And maybe that story tells you a lot about them. Just one final thing on my father, who I really worshiped. Both of them are gone now. My dad was shot down over Germany during World War II. He was in the Air Force, and he spent almost 2 years in a prisoner of war camp. And that, like it did for so many other people of his generation, that was such a searing and defining experience that which he never talked about until I was grown.
I was wondering
I've had the
if
chance.
yeah. Did he ever tell you much about that?
He did. He did. But like many of that generation, it wasn't something they talked about. But we might wake up in the morning and find my father asleep in the backyard. I mean, he didn't sleep well. He had terrible PTSD, which of course they didn't call PTSD then. Was much later. I mean, he was a man in his 70s by the time the VA finally said, yeah, maybe Mac, you got a little PTSD. But I had a chance to talk to Tom Brokaw, who of course wrote the brilliant book about the greatest generation. And so many of those stories that Tom tells in the book are just so reminiscent of my father and ultimately the men he served with. So anyway, that was my growing up. My mother was a fierce, and she had the most beautiful blue eyes, and was very active in our church, where she was on the board, and really cared about the community and really cared about me, and made sure I do that every day of my life.
Which church did you go to? Just curious.
High Street Congregational Church.
I think I covered during my internship. I covered when that burned, and it had to be rebuilt. I don't know if you remember that. And that was a really
long after I'd grown up. But yes,
that was an amazing. That was a huge loss in the community when that happened. In your reporting, you've been open about the fact that you were adopted and the kind of experience it was for you, and the connection. Some of the connections you made when your son was born, and how that informed your relationship. You have a very close relationship with your son, Spencer. I was curious to learn a little bit about that from you.
Yeah, well, yes. I've always known that I was adopted. My mother had taken, I think, 5 pregnancies virtually to term, 4 of them in the 8th month, and miscarried. And so the doctor said to her, I love this, Dr. Twaddle said to her, Arlene, you can't keep doing this. You're not going to survive another one of these. And so he said, usually I wait for my patients to raise it, but I think you two would be such wonderful parents. Would you consider adoption? And so they said that they would. And he said, well, you're going to get a call from me one night. So sure enough, one night they got a phone call, and he said, go over to the hospital, Central Maine General then, and I have 3 little girl babies who are available for adoption. And I was screaming my lungs out. And the nurse picked me up, handed me to my mother, and I stopped crying. And my mother looked at my father and said, Warren, I think this is our baby. And he said, I agree. And that was that. Things were simpler back in those days. I'm 64 years old. It's not the way the process works now. But that was one lucky day for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I mean, listen, I never looked like anyone. I've never had a relative who I was biologically related to, at least that I knew. So when I had this amazing little child, Spencer, I remember so distinctly looking at his baby toe, which I have a funny little pointy bottom of my baby toe, and he had the same thing. And I was like, Eureka, biology is biology. So yeah.
That's interesting. You two recently, there's a new article out in Town and Country. You took a road trip across country. That must have been, that was an interesting experience. Solidified.
Well, I mean, people may have thought it was ill-advised. It was in the middle of the pandemic. It was this summer. Spencer's going to school in Los Angeles and had an apartment with 5 other boys. And, when they came home for school break in March, they thought they were going right back. So we had to go close the apartment. And we didn't feel flying at that point was safe. And so we decided to drive. Now, the only hitch was Spencer had a permit, but no license, and really did not like to drive. Boy who grew up in New York City, where it's just not, I had a license from the minute I could get a license. If you grow up in Maine, you want that license.
Right.
But anyway, so the upshot is Spencer learned to drive. He got his license week before last. So we're in good good shape. But it was an extraordinary experience. We drove 7,500 and I think 24 miles, which Spencer pointed out is the circumference longer than the circumference of the moon, and which put it in some perspective. And it was an extraordinary opportunity to see each other in lots of different circumstances, and also to see our country.
Yeah, amazing experience. That's a wonderful thing. Now, your son Spencer, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is named after Spencer Tracy. Is that
he was named by Katharine Hepburn? Yes, and so yes.
Well, that's what I'm interested to know about your. You had a very dear friendship with Katharine Hepburn. I'm interested to know how you became friends with her, and then what she was like, obviously, and then how you became executor of her estate. That's a lot of responsibility. Curious about all that.
So I got to meet her as a result of my freshman year roommate at Bowdoin. Actually, she lived across the hall, but we really stayed together all 4 years. Amy Patterson Baird had a house at Fenwick in Connecticut, which isn't far from where I live now, and on Long Island Sound. And I was rigging a sailboat to go sailing with her brother one day, and Katharine Hepburn, who lived next door, came out and said, "What are you doing?" And so, So anyway, we had an extended conversation about, from her perspective, what fools we were to go sailing, and et cetera. Anyway, it started a conversation that went on for the next, probably 30 years. Wow. She was an extraordinary, I don't need to tell you, she was an amazing woman. Right. And I was just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. I've tried for years to figure out, it's obvious what I saw in her, but why, how did I fall into this incredible friendship? And, I think she was at a point in her life, and I now can appreciate it more because I'm at the point in my life where she wanted to explain her rules for living to someone, and she didn't have children. And I think I just happened through the picture at exactly the right moment. And man, she had a lot of rules, and I was a willing student. So
that's interesting. That's interesting. Are they rules that you've jotted down? Like, did she share them in that way, or are you?
Oh, they're indelible. We didn't have to write them down. I'm gonna give you a few.
Okay.
Never sleep on sheets that aren't white. It'll change your personality. Hold on, I'm dropping my earphone. Who says that? Never burn wood that you haven't chopped yourself or stolen. These are the rules. Never use an electrical appliance before 9 a.m. Anyway, she had a lot of rules. And let me just get this other earphone so I don't lose you. Just a minute. I'm not going away. I'm just getting this. So she was an amazing person, and some of them were, she was irreverent, and she was singular, and I was very lucky to be friends with her, and I learned so much from her.
Did she give you any advice on men based on her experience? Did she ever let you in on
she gave my
secrets?
husband, I was about to marry someone, and I married him at her house, and beautiful circumstances, and with my family all there. And she said to the man I was about to marry, "Don't marry this girl. She's out for herself. She wants to have a career, and she's going to make you miserable." Well, she was right about that. So,
wow.
He didn't take the diversion, but we married anyway. I'm not sure that was exactly the entire problem, but she was onto something. She was very independent. She didn't think you had to be involved in a relationship to have a happy life. She thought you could, but that from her perspective and her philosophy was that men and women would be happier if they lived next door. Maybe.
Isn't that interesting? That's interesting.
I
might agree with that.
Who knows?
So she named your son?
So his father and I went to see her before he was born. I was very pregnant, and she said, "We have to discuss the name." Mm-hmm. So she first offered Tom, which was her father's name and a beloved brother who had passed on. And I said I didn't cotton to that. And then she said, with a little twinkle, "Well, all right then, Spencer." So he became Spencer.
That's a good one. That's a good one, I gotta say. And a good story to go with it. You have described how Watergate was as a kid, inspired you to become a journalist, and you got a law degree after graduating from Bowdoin. And it just seems to me from looking at your body of work that there's a powerful sense of seeking justice, and that carries right through the recent report on the child miners of Madagascar, which in recent days has won both an Emmy and a Murrow, distinguished awards. And that's a heartbreaking humanitarian crisis that, as I was watching it, I felt responsible. I felt we're all responsible. If you own a cell phone, if you own a car, tell us about what's happening in Madagascar and your experience in reporting that.
Well, first, thank you. While Watergate was sort of the wormhole that brought me into the profession, I wanted to be part of that group of people that got to ask questions and shine a light on what was happening. I guess I wanted, as I progressed in the profession, found that I wanted to give a voice to people who might not otherwise have one. In fact, who didn't have one.
Right.
And so these kids were just a part of that ongoing reality. I've done a lot of reporting about women and children in crisis, both here at home and around the world. I work with an incredible team of journalists at NBC. And I had a couple years before the Madagascar story said to my producers, "Where is the worst place in the world to be a child?" Well, it turned out that the UN had just done a report indexing the worst places in the world to be a child. And regrettably, there are way too many competitors for that title. But the Central African Republic, a place that most people haven't even heard of, came out on top because of the ongoing civil war there. And so we had done a deep investigation and gone to the Central African Republic to report on it. It was a place that no Western journalist had been, I can't remember, for 4 or 5 years at that point, because it was so dangerous. So that was an important step in the network was amazing. NBC was amazing in supporting us in doing that. And so, and we were able to raise a couple $2 million for UNICEF for those kids as a result, which is really speaks to the power of the medium. We went on the Today Show with it and said to people, listen, if you're moved to help, here's how. And in increments, this means so much to me. It wasn't big checks. It was in increments of $5 and $10. Millions of Americans stepped up and said, let us help. And that was so moving. So, we wanted to keep that going. We wanted to see what else we could do when we had heard about a story that had not been covered at all, which was about Mica. Now, I think of Mica and I think of those little shiny parts and the rocks we'd pick up on the roads, right? No. Sheet mica is what this story is about. Sheet mica is it's big. It literally in sheets comes out of these, and it's used in every car and every cell phone and every computer, as you alluded to, Kelley. And it turns out that in order to get this sheet mica, children, some as young as 2 and 3, are lowered into pits, airless, dangerous pits to mine it. And so their story had never been told. And we were lucky enough to be able to go and tell it.
Whole
And,
families. I was struck
yeah.
that it was like whole families, a mother and her and all of her children guarding the hole at night so nobody else gets in there, and then
They'd sleep on
going
the rocks.
down together with her with one on her back, and then for pennies compared to the billions that these companies are making on their products. So it was really,
I mean, well, and these children have, as you might imagine, no childhood. There are no schools. I had never been to a place, even in the Central African Republic, where we were in Madagascar. There was no infrastructure. There were no hospitals. There were no roads. We had to off-road to get there. These are very remote. Doesn't even capture it. And so I guess maybe it would be fair to say I have rarely been in a circumstance where I thought it was so important that we raise our voices in order to give these kids a shot. And I'm happy to say that as a result of the reporting, international laws are changing, companies are stepping up. Some major auto manufacturers are now joining with those concerned about these mica issues and trying to source the mica in a more responsible way. So, we're hoping. But yes, those are the kinds of stories that are really meaningful. I mean, there are plenty of domestic stories on the same. And we did a story earlier that last year about military families and how many of them didn't have enough money to feed their children. The benefit follow if the member of the military is deployed, the food allowance goes with him or her. And so all over the country. I mean, I was shocked to discover that on military bases, there are food banks. I mean, surely we can, as one member of Congress said, it would be a rounding error to be able to bring these people up to a standard where they don't have to scrape for food. So those kinds of stories are important to me as well.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because it's something I face in some stories. So on a personal level, I'm interested. But when you've reported some of the biggest news events, some of them like Madagascar, that's a story that not many people knew about. So you're shining a light on it. When it's a situation like the family separations that you reported on the southern border, and when things don't change, when you're you're reporting something, it tugs at your heartstrings. How do you keep your emotions in check? And how do you stay neutral in your reporting, especially now that we know that there are more than 500 children who still haven't been reunited because the U.S. officials didn't keep records with the intention of ever reuniting them? How do you do it? How do you manage that?
Well, I think I don't know. I think that it is. I mean, I always think about it in terms of being a surgeon, or you have to be able to be human enough to feel what the person you're telling their story is, and if you don't, you're not doing your job. And at the same time, if you get so involved that you stop feeling, you can't do your job either. You can't feel too much and you can't feel too little. You have to find a path through, I think. Otherwise, you're not able to. And as far as neutrality goes, I think the idea that journalists somehow aren't affected is just a canard. It's impossible, and I don't think you want that. I think what we do want to do is be fair. And so you have to fight against your own prejudices when you can identify them. And it's really important to try to do that. But fairness is what we want. And not to hide behind a sort of the myth of even-handedness. There's a very interesting, I can remember Howard Stringer was once the president of CBS News, and I was seated next to him at a dinner. And he said, Cynthia, beware the myth of even-handedness. And I said, what's the myth of even-handedness? He said, if I'm doing a profile about you and I find 3 people who love you and 3 people who hate you, now I've found the truth. It may or may not be, but your job is to do better than that. Your job is to, present the tabloid. You're trying to find the truth is complicated, but a truth, and to then be responsible for it. So, I've tried to remember that. The myth of even-handedness really sinks a lot of reporters, I think. It's just kind of, it's too simplistic. I don't know.
It's also challenging in in recent years, where we have a situation where what is the truth, and alternative truths and things like that. So maybe there's trust mixed in, right? So
Yeah.
if you have a relationship with the people that you're reporting to, that they can trust that you're getting close to the truth, right? Somewhere close.
Well, I think trust is really, I think you're pointing out something really important. Since these things have been studied, Americans now have less confidence in institutions, in government, in journalism, in our very election system than they have ever had. And so trust is really important. And I think the other thing that really helps is when you say, if you don't know. I can remember Peter Jennings was still anchoring ABC, who was a great mentor and friend of mine. And I was out there, and we were doing a lot of live coverage then. And he asked me a question live. And I said, Peter, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find out, and I'm going to let you know. And, it was so stunning to the audience that it created this kind of avalanche. But of course, no one knows everything. So, I think being candid is part of it, and being human is another, and being fair. Right. Being fair is, what is it the Potter Stewart said about pornography? It's like fairness. You know it when you see it. Right. You do know it when you see it. Right. And as for alternatives, whoops, I think we just lost our camera. Just a second. Hold it. We'll fix that.
We're here.
We're here. We're still here, people. We're here. Whoops. I don't know where my Spencer was supposed to do that. So he's going to have his salary doc today. There we go.
You're back.
Okay,
You're
we're
back.
Moynihan said everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. There are knowable facts. And I think as journalists, we shouldn't shy away from those either. So
I agree. I agree.
Too late, Spence, I did it.
When the Me Too wave hit the news business, you were open about experiencing sexual discrimination or harassment. I'm curious how you dealt with that, and what your advice would be to other women who face it.
Well, I must say what you're referring to is I told a story on television about one of my first jobs in television, and the boss told me what the salary was going to be. And I said, but I happen to know the guy who had this job before me was making twice that. And he said, well, you don't have ex-wives to support. And I said, I don't think that's supposed to be any part of the calculation. And he said, do you want the job or not? I took the job, and I'm glad I did. But that wasn't so very long ago. I guess that was 1984. So obviously I had just graduated from law school, so I knew pretty well that wasn't how it was supposed to work.
Right.
So it's really hard to, things happen in subtle and direct ways. I found that the best cure for me was to put my nose down and do the work. I think I can be pretty intimidating when I want to be, and I think that prevented a lot of shenanigans. But I don't expect everybody to be quite as I am. You know, I could sniff it out from a great distance and put a stop to it pretty fast. But I don't know. I think women, I guess I would say this. I think having female friends is really important, and female mentors. And as there are more and more in the workplace, I hope for women it's going to get better. I was very, it was often the case that I would be the only woman in the room. And for some women, that meant they didn't want other women to be in the room. They liked being the only woman. For me, that wasn't the case. And I have really worked hard in my career to give opportunities to young women, to mentor them. I have a whole group of former assistants who I still am in close touch with, who are doing all kinds of great things. And I think, you know, I think standing up for yourself and finding allies to stand up for yourself is the only path forward.
Well, somebody submitted an early question in advance, wanting to know who inspired you in your career, who some of your mentors might have been. So maybe that's just a good segue here, where we can talk a little bit about who those people are for you, who those people were for you, and maybe how you, as you're being that for other women as well.
Well, I'll tell you, Barbara Walters was incredibly helpful to me. I wouldn't have been at ABC if it hadn't been for Barbara Walters. I had met her many years earlier. She was a frequent guest at Katharine Hepburn's house for dinner. And so I'd gotten to know her a little bit. And I had started my on-camera career. I had been a producer before this, but I had started as an anchor at Court TV, and which was, you know, a tiny little blip in the world of broadcast news, but nonetheless. And it had worked. It had gotten I had gotten a lot of attention in the network. Had gotten a lot of attention, and I had gotten a job offer from NBC and from CBS. And so when Barbara found this out, she was outraged. And one night I went to a party for her. It was one of her anniversaries at ABC, and she was standing next to the head of ABC News, Roone Arledge, and she said to him, "Roone, I am the past. This girl is the future, and you're a fool if you don't hire her." So thank you very much, Barbara Walters. And so they did. And so forever, she maintains that I owe her 15%, and she's quite right, but I have not paid up. Peter Jennings was an amazing journalist and a remarkable mentor. He was a citizen of the world. He understood it. He cared about it. Never graduated from college, never went to college. Was a self-educated man in many ways, but was really tough, really tough on me, really tough on everybody he worked with, and most of all on himself. But he set standards, and he expected you to meet those standards. And it was a wonderful learning environment. Fred Friendly, who some of the audience may have heard of, you may know him because George Clooney played him in the movie Good Night and Good Luck about Edward R. Murrow and his collaboration at CBS. He was Edward R. Murrow's producer. He was Walter Cronkite's producer. He was the president of CBS News. He quit as president of CBS News when the CBS brass insisted on running the I Love Lucy reruns as opposed to a Senate hearing on the Gulf of Tonkin. And he was so outraged, he quit. He was a man of great principle, and I worked for him and learned a lot from him. We did a series of public television programs about the presidency, about ethics, about all kinds of pressing matters of the day. And with many of the former presidents, with all the former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, it was an heady experience. They were called, the first series was The Constitution, That Delicate Balance. And it was really extraordinary. It was shot at Constitution Hall. And then we went to all of the former presidential libraries, except Nixon. He wouldn't do the Nixon Library and wouldn't have President Nixon on, but the rest of them we did, the living presidents. Anyway, it was an extraordinary experience. He was really, really tough. He threatened to defenestrate me just about every day, which means throw me out the window. I had to look it up. But I was.
Did he actually say that?
Oh,
did he actually
yeah.
say defenestrate you?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I said to him once, Fred, is it true that you threw a chair at Eric Severide when he wouldn't go to Vietnam? And he goes, that is a complete lie, Cynthia. It was a desk.
That's good.
Anyway, you get the picture.
Yeah.
Morley Safer became a dear friend and lived out here in Connecticut, not far from me. And he had worked for Fred as well when Fred was a much younger man at CBS. So we had lots of fun telling Fred's stories. So yeah, he was also inspiring to me. And I will say Leslie Stahl has been a great friend and someone that I have admired. I admired before I knew her. She was really a trailblazer for women in this business because she knew how to maintain her poise and ask the toughest of questions. And I admire her to this day, and admired her the other day with her interview with the president. I mean, she's an extraordinary, straight ahead, fair journalist, and I've learned a lot from her, and I'm happy to call her a friend now.
Before we get to some of the viewer questions, you get back to Maine often, and where are your favorite spots to visit?
I don't get to Maine as often as I used to. I was on the governing boards at Bowdoin for a while, and that was really a thrill. So that got me up to Maine quite a bit. And I was just recently in Maine visiting my cousin who had her knee replaced. She's now doing very well. Thank you very much. And so Spencer and I had a grand visit. We stayed in the Portland area, had lots of good things to eat. And I love visiting Maine. I say to Spencer every time we cross the border into Maine, I breathe differently. It's good to be home, and it will always be home. So no matter where I live, Maine is home.
Reading some of the questions that have been submitted here. What type of story would you most like to do in future news? Would it be human interest, political? I think we've touched on some of that, but
yeah, listen,
maybe what are you working on?
Right at the moment, I'm working on, I'm part of this Vote Watch team that NBC stood up about 4.5 years ago to look at election systems and how they work and how they don't, foreign influence in the election process. So I've spent the day, I'm getting hoarse, I've spent the day interviewing former FBI, Homeland Security officials about some of the more recent news about what's going on in terms of cybersecurity. I did a piece last night on the nightly news about absentee ballots and how frequently the rate of rejection and why, which these small margins in some swing states may make a big difference this year because there are so many more mail-in ballots. So I've been taking a close look at the election system, but I also have another big investigation coming out about mail order pharmacies, which I'm not going to tell you any more than that, but that's the topic, and that'll be hitting as soon as we have a runway to land it on. Right now, as you know from watching the news, most of the airspace is being taken up by the election. So, but that'll be coming out. And I'm going to go back to Navajo Nation. I did a lot of reporting at the beginning of the pandemic about the crisis on Navajo Nation. They had the highest infection rate of any place in the country at the beginning.
For COVID?
Right. And, but they did, and 30% of the people there don't have running water, and 30% of the people there don't have electricity in America in 2020. So muse on that for a moment. How do you fight the COVID virus when you can't wash your hands?
Right.
So they did something that is so unbelievably impressive. They actually cut their curve. They broke it. And they did that because they followed public health guidelines, and they, as they tell it, they cared about the community enough to do the things that you need to do in order to stop its spread. So even with a profound lack of resources, they have been able to do something that much of our country hasn't been able to do. So anyway, I'm going back to Navajo Nation for stories, not these we're going to have to adjust this earphone, for some stories that don't have anything to do with COVID, but look at some of the infrastructure questions and problems on Navajo Nation.
That's
So.
really important. I'll be looking forward to that. That's a good one. Some are a little political here. I don't know how you feel about addressing some. Do you feel that the Trump administration should be tried for crimes against humanity? You're put on your legal cap here, and what do you think?
Look. Well, so there's an area that I don't wade into political.
Yeah.
I appreciate the question, and I think that people of goodwill can have very different views about this, but I'm a registered independent. I think it's important to try to, and while the question may, I don't want to sound like a Supreme Court nominee here, but the question may come before me.
Right.
So, I think there are some things that have happened in the last 4 years which are deeply concerning. And I think that many of those things need to be looked at very, very closely. But I'm not in a position to weigh an opinion about that at this point. But thanks for the question.
That's okay. Do you think it's fair to publish or produce news stories with confidential sources?
As someone who's done that, I think that I understand why the public is troubled by it, and I'm troubled by it too. But there are some kinds of stories that you just can't do if you don't have sources. And some of those are some of the most important stories there are. People who, and most reputable news organizations won't publish based on just one anonymous source. You have to be able to multi-source it, sometimes with documents. NBC standards are very high in this regard. And trust me, having been worked over by the NBC lawyers and standards people on a variety of stories, I can tell you the story has to be of enough significance to do that, because I think that viewers hate it. I mean, because how can a viewer evaluate an anonymous source? And it's sort of like the horrible thing on the internet, right? You can say anything if you're willing to be anonymous. So I think it's with a great degree of skepticism and reluctance, but sometimes I think the story is important enough. There are some times when someone's in the room, let's put it that way, with direct knowledge of something that has happened that needs to be reported, then if you can verify it, usually it's at least two sources before you can use an unnamed source. Having said that, reluctantly, yes. Good question.
Yeah. At the Press Herald, it ends up being with stories that where there are the victims, where you can't, when it comes to victims of abuse or things like that, where there's or when we've reported on immigrants who have been persecuted or things like that, very narrow situations.
And I think that viewers and readers can understand that better than what I took the question to mean. I've done a lot of national security reporting.
Right.
We were the first to report that Vladimir Putin was behind the scheme to try to interfere in the U.S. election. We broke that story.
Right.
And that was based upon intelligent sources who were talking to us, who didn't feel they had another outlet. We knew what positions these people held. We knew a lot about them, and there was also a history, which is another important part of this. So those kinds of stories, it's tricky. Trust me, you don't want to have to rely on anonymous sources, but sometimes it's important that the public know the truth. And if you can, if that's the only way to get it, then I'm going with it.
Any insight on the two candidates, personal experiences interviewing the two presidential candidates?
I don't cover politics. I opted out of covering politics a long time ago. The horse race of it all just isn't all. I mean, policies are really interesting to me, but the horse race of it all was not something that appealed to me. I will say that during the 2008 campaign, I was the anchor of Nightline, and I spent a lot of time on the road with Hillary Clinton, with John McCain, Mrs. McCain, John McCain's mother, who just died. I spent an entire day on his campaign bus with her, which was a real treat and a real experience. What a character. Within 2 minutes of meeting me, she said, John's father and I never had any hope for him. He was just such a terrible student. And he was a wild child too. And after about it, we were alone for about a half an hour, and John McCain came back and he goes, "Mother, are you telling this journalist the truth again?" So anyway, I mean, I'm fascinated by people. I spent a lot of time on Hillary Clinton's campaign. I interviewed her many, many times, maybe 12 times in big, beefy interviews. And I will say, people always said, well, was she different in person than she was? And she was different in person. She wasn't ever able, I think, and she wasn't comfortable on television. And so she was very, even after she left office, I interviewed her as Secretary of State too. I went to Russia, actually went to Russia with her on when she was Secretary of State, and Australia, a couple of big trips. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I ever penetrated her very controlled presentation, to be honest.
We have a good question here, and it was submitted earlier as well. When you were talking about your early experience watching the Watergate proceedings, and I think you described yourself in one story as laying on your belly, and I could just imagine you watching like that. But it had to have been on in the house to some extent. And I was curious because I grew up in a home where the news was important. We got a morning paper, an afternoon paper. We watched the nightly news. Time magazine came, and I fought my dad to read it. He got to read it first. And the question that was submitted is, how can we encourage young people in Lewiston, Auburn, or in any city, USA, really, to become engaged and involved in the world around them? And it just struck me when I saw it earlier, and parents have a significant role in helping that happen. So I was wondering, what do you think?
Hey, listen, I don't have any magic plan, but like you, I grew up in a household where the news mattered. I mean, it was part of the fabric. The evening news was on every night at 6:30. We got the Lewiston papers in the morning and in the afternoon. I was Edward Little had a editor, the student page. I was the editor of that when I was in high school. So yeah, I mean, it was just a part of the fabric of life. But this next generation consumes news differently than we did.
It's true.
Sadly, from my perspective and yours, because we're part of the old dogs of information presentation. I mean, my son gets his news online now. just like every newspaper, every broadcast isn't the same. Neither is information that you can find online. Digital, your newspaper has a vibrant digital presence. So does my network. And so some of what young people are consuming is the same news as older people, just in a different format. So that's one thing. And then there are all of these, the internet doesn't have an editor. So an awful lot of the information that's out there is not real. And people believe it. And so it becomes, in their minds real. So I think one of the concerns I have is in helping not just young people, but all of us navigate our way through what trusted sources of news and information are. And one of my former bosses, Steve Brill, has just launched in the last year a whole operation which is designed to do just that, rating various news sources for their accuracy and their truthfulness and their dependability. And I think, such a thing, it looks to be a really successful path. But we need to figure out where those trusted sources are, because everything shouldn't be obviously trusted.
Well, that's it, and certainly, it's not an age thing necessarily.
Right.
It is important to get kids involved, but there's a certain need to have everybody engaged, but not in silos. And it's frustrating when something like QAnon happens, where it's identified as being made up, right? And the whole line of, and there are people within it, built into it is the idea that if people say this is false, they're part of the problem, right? We're the truth, they're the problem. So it's really getting youth engaged. I think one of the things maybe is supporting that the questioning and the critical thinking, right? Getting that's what I'm wondering how you've connected with young people over time in that way. Have you ever reached out and felt that connection with young people and encouraged them in that way? Outside of Spencer. Obviously.
Spencer's sick of my encouragement. Yes, he's definitely not going to be a journalist. Maybe a writer of fiction. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, all right, here's my base case. There's always going to be a need for and a desire for stories. So journalism has a vibrant present and future. The form of journalism is evolving. And I think that we need, for a long time, I sort of turned up my nose at the whole digital thing. But that's wrong. I mean, it's a very effective way of communicating. But I agree with you. We have to all be critical and questioning, and we don't want to believe anything. All right, I'll give you a great Peter Jennings story. Peter Jennings used to say that a journalist was a person who, when handed a dollar bill, turned it over to see what was on the other side. Yeah, and I guess as citizens, we need to do that.
Right.
We need to do that. We have to be willing to turn it over and see what's on the other side.
Right. You're working from home.
We're sitting in my front hall. This is the front hall of the house in Connecticut. Yep.
Right. I was hoping you could sort of tell us a little bit about what it's like working there. I can, I'm the same, where a lot of us are working from home. What are you doing to keep sane? I heard a little bit, painting and gardening, and how are you coping?
Well, first of all, I'm working harder than I've ever worked because, I don't have any commute time. I don't have anything. Here we are. So Spencer says, Mom, you need a hobby. I I said, "You're my hobby." He said, "That's my point precisely." So anyway, that was many years ago. I have always loved to draw. I had never taken any kind of painting class and never painted. But I had taken a drawing class a few years ago at the Art Students League in New York. And now, because of COVID, they're offering their classes online. So I am Zooming a painting class twice a week, which has been incredibly rewarding and relaxing, and lets my brain go in a different place. So that's been great. I do yoga a couple times a week, Zooming. I have a garden, first vegetable garden. I've always liked flowers, but we have a vegetable garden this year. And, you know, it's been a very, I've liked to cook, but cooking takes time. And so Spencer and I have both taken some cooking classes, and I must say that we're eating very well. So, you know, a little bit slower pace there are some advantages. And we've had some great conversations that we might not otherwise have had. So there are parts of this being homebound which have been very satisfying. I am a woman who has lived much of her life on an airplane, and I have never slept continuously in my own bed this much since I think maybe I was in high school. I mean, I've been home, so it's been good.
Exciting. Yeah. I'm curious if you, with all that you've experienced, wonderful career, and certainly more to come, but we had one question. Somebody wanted to know if you plan to write a book about your experiences at some point.
Well, I've been nattering on about writing a book for many years now. And so I hate to, I don't know, maybe if I say it, I'll make it true. I haven't so far. Yeah, I am going to write a book at some point. There are a lot of things that I have accumulated along the way that I'd like to say. But I don't want to do it while I'm still working. I don't think. I don't know that I could my days are pretty full as it is. I usually get up about 5:30 or 6 and usually go through the evening news and sometimes after that. Such as the job is that it requires a lot of concentration. So I don't really feel that I have the bandwidth right now. But yes, I'm going to write a book. Now I've said it to my folks in Maine. So now I'm gonna have to do it.
You heard it here first, folks.
There you go. Well, yeah, unless you've been at my house for dinner, and I've said it, every year for the last 6 or 7. But yeah, okay, I'm gonna do it.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great experience for me, and I really appreciate you sharing this hour with all of us. And maybe next time you're in Maine, you could stop by the Press Herald. Maybe we'll be back in our offices.
There you go. Well, Kelley, you're a wonderful interviewer, and I thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, and to the audience, thank you. Some of those questions were tough, but I got to get new earphones. They've fallen out like 5 times. You'd think I did this for a living.
Well, anyway, kudos to Spencer for his IT. I need my own IT here. I need some help with that.
You got to raise them. You got to raise them right. Here we go.
Great.
Nice to talk to you, Kelley, and to everybody in Maine. Have a good, safe winter.
Thank you very much. You as well. Take care.